With the success of the first Uncharted game, and how synonymous it is with the Sony PlayStation 3, it came as no surprise to anyone when a sequel soon followed. Produced by Naughty Dog and released for the Sony PlayStation 3 in 2009, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves continues the story of Nathan Drake and his companions roughly a year after the events of the first game. For the purposes of this review, I played this game on the Sony PlayStation 4 within the Uncharted The Nathan Drake collection. After a death-defying set-piece sequence where we are not timeline-oriented, the game opens as Nate is knocking back a cold one at the Benoi Island resort, presumably just before a zombie outbreak. He is interrupted by an old friend with associate in tow, and conversation turns to the topic of Marco Polo's lost voyage. After a little convincing, Nate decides to help them infiltrate the Istanbul Palace Museum in order to heist a Mongolian oil lamp that may help locate the missing fleet, for the cash of course. Due to the way that the narrative starts with the exclusion of any support character from the previous game, it's initially unknown whether this game is a sequel or a prequel. I kind of liked this, as Nate's nefarious company led me to initially believe that this may have been a prequel, as Nate struck me as being more of a morally correct character in the first game. The museum heist sees Nate venturing with old friend Harry Flynn as they attempt to infiltrate the premises without being seen. I use the word attempt because I got caught so many times, though I did think it was a nice way to introduce the stealth mechanic, which plays a bigger role in this game. Now, you can sneak around and take out enemies unseen. By doing this, you can reduce the amount of ammo that you need to expend, and you can also limit the number of enemies you'll have to face. One thing that I didn't like about this intro sequence was that if you are seen, even once, it's counted as a game over and you need to start from the last checkpoint. Additionally, you are given a tranquilizer gun, which is only ever used in this part of the game and never again, so I felt that it was wasted potential. Also, for having a goal of taking out opponents silently and without harming them, I failed to see how whacking someone's head against the side of a marble fountain could be considered non-lethal. Anyway, after completing the first mission, the story really opens up. In the first game, Nate was relegated to some small island exploration, but this game ups the ante by setting the scenario on the world stage. Rather than being confined to such a small area, Nate and his companions will visit not only dense rainforests, but also a war-torn Middle Eastern city and the snowy peaks of the Himalayas in search for Marco Polo's hidden treasure. I specifically mention companions because often Nate is paired with another character in order to progress. No longer will Nate have to suffer isolation and the slow, creeping black dog of depression that encroaches upon his mind every time he is forced to face an army of foes alone. The AI for the support characters are proficient with the use of their weapons, and can aptly take down enemies quickly. They also cannot die and have unlimited ammo, so it's nice to let them do some of the heavy lifting from time to time. Using them as a distraction so you can sneak up behind the enemies is a strategy that I found myself making use of from time to time. The larger cast of characters also supports Nate from a narrative perspective, giving us a better view of who he is as a character. Where he still has the playful back and forth banter with Sully, there's also Chloe, who he has more of a romantic affiliation with. The characters can also act independently with their own motivations and don't need Nate in order for them to be relevant. An example is that Sully bows out, stating,
"I'm getting too old for this bullshit,"
which seems in line with how someone of his age would act, rather than pushing himself to seek a treasure that would probably end with his death. Consequently, in some instances you are paired with Chloe and even Elena, who are not as agile as Nate and sometimes struggle to make certain jumps, or sometimes outright just cannot traverse a path that Nate can. I enjoyed the diversity that the cast brought to this game in this respect, and appreciated that Nate is just as clumsy and charming as ever, though he still seems to have more lives than a cat.
Oh boy.
Like its predecessor, the game is played via exploration, climbing, and combat, though this time around there's also set pieces which brings the game more in line with something you'd expect from a modern Tomb Raider game. There are often times when the object Nate is climbing will break, bringing down the environment around him. Whilst I thought these set pieces were fun and they did make my palms sweat, the sheer number of them made me start to think that Nate really should buy a lottery ticket. With how close to dying he often comes, that luck from staving off the brink of death would far better be placed into winning the jackpot than adventuring through crumbling ruins, though that would probably make for a boring experience as the player. Areas in the game now have a greater level of verticality to them and a number of routes which allow you to more effectively strategize how you want to approach any given fight. Where in the previous game battles would be telegraphed, this time around most of them seem more natural, as enemies are already in place, so you can determine the best way to dispatch them. As with the previous game, Nate can only carry one big gun, one small gun, and a handful of grenades. I did complain about this in my previous review, however this time around I appreciated it, as it was more realistic and made the game more immersive. I sometimes found that I had to scramble to find a more suitable weapon to dispatch the various foes, as opposed to some games that allow you to carry a munitions depot in your pocket, hoarding your best weapons for the inevitable boss fights. I'm looking at you, Resident Evil. This time around there is a larger variety to enemies and the weapons that they use, meaning that sometimes you'll be required to think about how best to deal with each combat scenario. In the previous game, I often ran with the same two familiar weapons, but found that those same weapons were not always well suited to the situations I found myself in. For example, some enemies now use a riot shield, which a pistol simply cannot penetrate. I either had to use a shotgun, explosive weapon, or find some way to distract them, flank them, and then take them out. Flanking wasn't always an option later in the game either though, as you were constantly being barraged by enemies with shotguns and infrared scopes that could one-shot you if they lined you up in their sight. Thankfully, you are not asked to demonstrate any vehicle operation skills. No longer do you have to drive a jeep, or attempt to ride a jet ski up river rapids. Vehicle segments do exist, but Nate is exclusively a passenger. Depending on the vehicle, it makes for some interesting gameplay. For example, during the train section, not only does Nate have to deal with normal enemies, but also train signal lights that will fling him from the top or side of the carriage to an instant death. As for the jeep, he'll need to jump back and forth between vehicles that are being fired upon by a military copter, lest he combust in flames along with his steadfast footing. Melee combat has been completely overhauled, playing a bigger part in the narrative. No more will we watch on in shock as Nate swings around weak old limp chicken drumsticks, but rather he shows off his martial prowess through dodging and weaving around the attacks of any enemy that he engages with. You'd think, what with his newfound proficiency, that he took lessons from Little Mac. I enjoyed the hand-to-hand combat added a different edge to battles that could become a viable option if you ran out of ammunition. I mean, who wouldn't use everything at their disposal in the same situation? Compared to the first game, the puzzles are a lot more diverse and on a bigger scale, requiring you to do a lot more climbing more often than not. As with the previous game, Nate has access to his diary in order to help him solve these puzzles. As the player, you can flick through every page of his diary as you like, rather than the page being automatically flipped and stuck to the page most relevant to the puzzle. Some pages in the diary aren't even related to puzzle solving, and show a mischievous side of Nate that you wouldn't otherwise get to see. Treasure hunting returns from the first game as glowing objects that exist throughout the environment. If you press triangle when in the vicinity of a treasure, Nate will add it to his inventory. You can view fully rendered models of each item that Nate retrieves, and I felt that this time around the renders were in even higher detail. There are even more treasures to find this time, and some of them cannot be simply picked up from the ground, as they are out of reach, meaning that you'll need to find some way to get them down. Graphically, this game sees an improvement over the previous game with more cutscenes that are being motion captured. One of the details that I really liked was that when Nate was in a snowstorm, the sleet would catch up on his clothing and eyebrows, caking him. There are so many moments in the game where you can see the great care and attention to detail that Naughty Dog took, and it's very much appreciated. In every location, the environments have been perfectly captured, from the lush tropical rainforests to the wintry tundra of the Himalayas and the various temples that you encounter along the way. Everything is simply breathtaking and pushes the graphics beyond what we have seen in the previous title. Once again, the soundtrack was composed by Greg Edmondson. Leveraging his experience from composing for the first title, it's clear that he has improved his skills, as there are many more tracks and motifs found throughout this title. Each track orients itself with the surrounding environment and action. Where one moment you'll have a strong deluge of panicked brass, the next you'll have the crying strings of violins playing out a sad scene. In places where there is an absence of music, an ambient soundscape carries you through from the buzzing of flies in the depths of a rainforest to the blowing winds of a cold winter tundra in the Himalayas. Additionally, the voice acting is so on point, and conveys the emotions of the characters as they encounter the various traps, vices, and treasures throughout the narrative. Uncharted 2 Among Thieves took everything that the first game did and improved upon it tenfold. From the expanded combat to the numerous cutscenes that are scattered throughout the story, this game really went above and beyond. In the past, professional reviewers have praised this game many times over, and it's not difficult to see why. If you haven't played this game, then what are you waiting for? Go pick it up now. By the way, what other games are there around like Uncharted that you are interested in playing? I'm always on the lookout for more games to add to my gaming experience, so please let me know your recommendations in the comments. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.